Thank you. Hi, good evening. My name's James Cook from GL Hearn. I'm a planning director. I'm not an urban designer. I'm not an architect. I'm a commercial planner, and my role is largely about promoting development in London. I look after a team who are focused on residential development in London, and increasingly large proportions of our work involve tall buildings. What I'm going to talk to you this evening about is the research that we undertook earlier this year with the NLA. I've been involved with a tall building survey with the NLA for 3 years now, and the results that I'll talk about are from March this year. March is a long time ago. We've had some pretty significant political and economic changes in the last 6 months, obviously. And I think when we do the survey again next year, it'll be fascinating to see how the trends have changed in light of those political changes and suspected economic changes this year. I've given a similar talk before, and I've preceded Colin, which is the right way around. This is a pretty, I won't say dry, but this is the facts and figures, and then Colin, I'm sure, will bring it to life with what it means on the ground with some of the things that he's involved with at the GLA. So I will talk briefly about the methodology for the survey. I'll say a little bit about our findings in this year, and then I'll compare those to findings in the last year, and end with a couple of personal observations on what I think it means for London, and in particular housing in London. So how did we do it? Well, back in 2014, we teamed up with the NLA. I think at that point in time, tall buildings were becoming increasingly contentious, political, increasing interest in the press. And Peter Murray at the NLA realised, I think, that there's no actual assessment of the number of tall buildings in planning in London at that time. So it was the first attempt to quantify tall buildings in the pipeline, and back in April 2014 we found 236. We followed up that research a year later, and the increase had gone up to 263, and the methodology was to look across London, across all the boroughs. We assessed tall buildings as being those 20 stories or more, and we looked at buildings that were either proposed, i.e. in planning application or pre-application, with planning permission, and those which were under construction. The 20-storey threshold was a little bit controversial. We accept that tall buildings will be considered tall a lot lower than 20 stories, but we needed to draw a line somewhere. And I think from the NLA's perspective, they felt that a lot of the buildings, sort of 60s, 70s, residential tall buildings in London are typically at that 20-storey height, and people can kind of relate to those as being tall. We changed things slightly for the 2016 research. We got EGI, Estates Gazette, involved, and they managed to find additional projects over and above those ones that we'd found previously. They have a lot more intelligence on schemes that are in the pre-application process. And they had more detail about larger schemes that include a number of tall buildings, which I'll say a bit more about. But the overall parameters stayed the same, but as I go through the figures, they're not quite on a like-for-like basis from year to year. So these are the number of new tall building proposals in the year to April, and the key figure there is bottom right, 119. And that consists of 73 at the proposal stage, so 58 of those are at planning application, the rest of them are pre-application, and what we've always said is that is almost certainly an underestimate. We just don't know all of the schemes that are in pre-application because they're almost always not in the public realm. The approved figure there is 43, and that's a significantly high figure. That is applications that were submitted and approved during the course of the year, which I think you might say is quite a positive, or demonstrating an effective planning system. I think it reflects the amount of work that goes into these schemes before they actually get into planning, but it also masks the one scheme in Greenwich, which included 32 tall buildings within one scheme. So it's sort of take it with a slight pinch of salt. And equally, just 3 tall buildings were refused, and again, I think that is a reflection of the fact that the scale of work required in taking these to planning means that the level of certainty once you make the planning application means that they're very unlikely to actually be refused. We looked at construction, and the 89 tall buildings under construction at the point of time of the survey. That's 19% of all the tall buildings in the survey. We've seen a slight decrease in the number of tall buildings as a percentage under construction, although the overall numbers are still increasing. Again, will be very interesting to see those figures this time next year. As I said, 119 of the new proposals are at application stage, but the number of tall building schemes is much less than that. Lots of projects with multiple tall buildings, and this is the most notable, which I mentioned, which is Greenwich Peninsula. This got an outline consent this year. Difficult to quantify exactly how many tall buildings there are, given the sort of parameter nature of the permission, but we think it's around. There's consent for up to 32 tall buildings within one planning application, one planning permission. So to look back on how those figures compare over recent years, looking back across the 3 years of the survey, should reiterate this isn't entirely like-for-like assessment, but at 2016 we've got 111 which are proposed, i.e. in planning or post or pre-planning, 233 with planning permission, 3 that have been refused, 89 under construction, 19 completed, which is a total of 436 tall buildings in the pipeline for London.
James, can you just clarify, is there any double counting between years?
Yes, well there would be schemes that are in pre-planning in 2014, which will still be in pre-planning at 2016. So they're not increases, they're actual numbers at that point in time. But the point I want to reiterate is the overall number looks like a very big increase from 2015 to 2016, with the evidence base was changed. But we're confident in those 2016 numbers. And as I said, whilst I think the trend that we noticed there was that towers under construction increased, but the rate of increase in towers under construction had slowed year on year. We looked at building heights. This is pretty crude. It's just looking at story heights. This is all the tall buildings in the survey. The mean story height across all tall buildings in the survey is 30 stories, and 60%, 261 in actual terms, are in that 20 to 30 story range. That's consistent with what we've seen in previous years, and that is very consistent with the market economics that we see in tall building construction in most locations for most clients, in particular for the house builders. Only 8 tall buildings, or 2%, reach beyond 60 stories, but there is potentially a trend towards ever-increasing height. Of the 20 tallest buildings in the survey this year, 3 of them were new proposals. I should say that all of this information is available. It goes into greater detail than I'll explain tonight. But in terms of location, inner and outer London, that probably doesn't surprise anybody. Almost 3/4 are in inner London. I do think, and this might be something that Colin talks about, but I do think this has the potential to change as we look at this over coming years. A lot of the opportunity areas are in outer London, a lot of the areas around Crossrail and Crossrail 2 are in outer London, and some of the unrealised regeneration areas, I think, are probably in outer London, perhaps, rather than inner London. And then when you drill down slightly into the sub-regional sub-regional areas. Central and eastern sub-regions dominate with, again, 3/4 of tall buildings. The east, which would feel like a sort of mature tall building location, has increased very significantly over the last year, so there's even more stuff going on in East London. And north and west, as previous years, is much lower, but again, I think those sub-regions have significant potential. Old Oak Common in itself, if that comes forward, I think would change that demographic very significantly. This is probably hard to decipher, but this is by individual borough, and there's some striking trends there when you look at the variances. Perhaps most striking is that 160, so almost a third of the tall buildings in the survey, are in just 2 boroughs, and that's Tower Hamlets at the top with 93 and Greenwich further down with 67. Southwark, Lambeth, Wandsworth have seen significant growth in recent years, but we've seen a kind of stabilisation in terms of the numbers of proposals in those locations in this year's survey. But at the other end of the scale, there's 4 London boroughs which only have 1 or 2 proposals, and they're Sutton, Redbridge, Harrow and Enfield, and there's 8 London boroughs which don't have any tall building proposals at all. So almost a third of the London boroughs have either none or a negligible amount of tall building proposals. You can compare that with Tower Hamlets, and I think when you compare that with perhaps some commentators or the press's perception, then it is a very complex pattern of growth that we're seeing in tall buildings across London. And then when you look at that in terms of tall buildings that are under construction, I think it's even more polarised. Tower Hamlets way out ahead with 27% or 24% in real terms tall buildings under construction. Newham, Lambeth, Greenwich all have 11. But again here there's 17 London boroughs that don't have any tall buildings currently under construction. So again, where this is happening physically is probably only in about 50% of London boroughs. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about clusters and locations and whether this is responding to planning policy or not. What we've just tried to illustrate here is where we're seeing some of the clusters. The blue clusters are where there's 30 tall buildings or more, and they're all in areas identified at a strategic level for tall buildings. Vauxhall, heading west to east, Vauxhall, Nine Elms, South Bank, Docklands and the Peninsula. And then the orange clusters are where there's 10 to 30 tall buildings, and again these are in identified regeneration areas, Brent Cross, Stratford, Deptford. And then the green are where there is smaller clusters, but I think almost without exception, where these sorts of buildings are consented and are happening, they're happening in a planned way. Whether those plans are right or wrong is another debate, but they're generally only getting consent, and they're coming forward in locations identified at either London or the local level. My background's residential, and unsurprisingly, 3/4 of the tall buildings, 320 of them, are predominantly residential in use. Almost all tall buildings are mixed use to some degree. There's almost always a requirement for at least basement, ground and first probably to be a mix of uses. But the vast majority are predominantly residential. There is a significant proportion, I think, which we've considered to be genuinely mixed use. That's 18% of 77. But as you'll see, other uses make up a pretty limited contribution. Interestingly, office at just 4%. $18 tall buildings completed in the year to April. Those are they. One of the interesting things that we saw through the research was that the average time from getting a permission to being completed was 4 years, but that masks some huge variations between 2 years and 8 years, but an average of 4 years from permission to completion, and 18 tall buildings completed in the year. Some of the taller buildings in the survey, here's the top 3 residential buildings, up to 75 stories at City Pride. All 3 of those are in Docklands. And for the non-residential buildings, planning application at 1 Shelf, which I think is still current application. 1 Lansdowne Road is a mixed-use building in Croydon, which has actually since been refused. And Columbus Tower is a approved scheme that's been resubmitted for a revised scheme. So the summary observations are that I still believe that we're seeing a real importance on opportunity areas, strategic planning and master planning in the geographical distribution of tall buildings. I think in that context you could say there's an efficiency in the planning system. Tall building proposals generally receive a positive resolution, rightly or wrongly. But I do think that is because of the policy certainty and the level of investment that goes into bringing them through the application process. We've seen an increased number of tall buildings in overall in the last year. Construction levels have, however, remained relatively consistent. And as I say, I think next year's survey will be fascinating, particularly in terms of construction. My overall view on tall buildings is that they are one part, a relatively small part in real terms of London's housing growth, but they're obviously very significant in terms of other impacts. But they're only one part of a small part of a big issue. And in terms of housing, I've quoted this a few times, but if you took every tall building in the survey and you applied a sort of mean height to that and a mean floor plate, if they all got built, that would be about 1 year's housing requirement for London. They're not all going to get built, and as we've seen, they take between 2 and 8 years to get completed after planning. So even though there's a very large proportion of residential buildings in there, they, in terms of London's growth requirements, they are relatively insignificant. Thank you very much.